All right. Welcome, everyone, to Meteorology Matters, where we dig into all sorts of interesting weather and climate stuff, all that good stuff.
Yeah,
If you haven't already, make sure to follow meteorologist Rob Jones on Instagram at meteorologist and on TikTok at TV Meteorologist.
right.
And, of course, don't forget to subscribe to Rob Jones Hurricane on YouTube, where you can also find the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist.
Yeah, all the good stuff all in one place.
And today we're going to be talking about something that is pretty weird going on in dumbass Florida.
Yeah.
There's this proposed bill. It's Senate Bill 56, and it's trying to ban, quote unquote, geoengineering and weather modification activities, which when you first hear it maybe doesn't sound that crazy.
Right.
But this bill is really focused on chemtrails,
Yeah.
The conspiracy theory.
Oh, yeah.
And this has caused some debate down in dumbass Florida. And what's really interesting is that it's kind of getting mixed up with other discussions, like the whole fluoride in the water thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting how these things can really capture the public imagination and sometimes lead to, uh, policy decisions that maybe aren't based on the most solid scientific evidence.
Yeah. So our goal today is to really break down this dumbass Florida bill
Okay.
and understand the science behind contrails and weather modification that it's trying to address, and kind of see like what's the bigger picture here. What's going on.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's get into it.
So let's start with just like the actual bill.
Yeah.
SB 56 down in dumbass Florida.
Yeah, so essentially this bill wants to completely prohibit any kind of like injection or release or dispersion of, any substance into the atmosphere in
Right.
dumbass Florida. And the key part here is that it's specifically targeting activities that are intended to affect the temperature, the weather, or even the intensity of the sunlight.
Yeah, and it's not just like a random thought. Like they're really focused on chemtrails, which, if you're not familiar, is this conspiracy theory that's been around for decades now, that basically says that the government is like secretly spraying chemicals into the air for like, some kind of hidden purpose.
Right, exactly. And it's a fascinating example of how, these sort of like misinterpretations of perfectly natural phenomena can kind of snowball into these pretty elaborate conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and it's not just a ban. Like the bill goes further and suggests setting up this like hotline
Oh, wow.
for dumbass Florida residents to report, these suspected chemtrails, which, I mean, can you imagine?
I can only imagine the volume of calls.
Yeah. And then the dumbass Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP as they call it, would have to track all these complaints. And
Right.
Senator Garcia, who's sponsoring the bill, has even said that this might require like more staff and resources. And, just it makes you wonder like what kind of data are they really expecting to get out of this?
Yeah, it's definitely a curious use of resources, to say the least, especially when the scientific community has already pretty thoroughly debunked these claims.
Right.
And it's worth noting that this bill actually received bipartisan support in the Senate Appropriations Committee on Agriculture, Environment, and General Government, which I think speaks to how much these concerns, even if they are unfounded, are really resonating across the political spectrum.
Yeah, that was surprising to me that it was bipartisan, but it gets even more interesting.
Oh, really?
The bill also wants to drastically increase the penalty for doing any kind of weather modification operations without a permit, like going from $500
Right.
to a whopping $10,000.
Wow.
And not only that, but it also wants to completely repeal all the other weather modification laws that are already in place in dumbass Florida.
Oh, wow. So it's like
Yeah.
they're taking this incredibly drastic approach to, regulating, or rather, I guess, prohibiting weather modification, both the real and the imagined.
Yeah, like they're using a sledgehammer to deal with, a ghost, essentially.
Precisely.
Yeah. And it goes even further than that.
What else could there be?
The bill also would take away the power of state agencies to even study weather modification for like emergency situations.
Yeah.
Like let's say there's a really dense fog
Right.
that's causing safety issues. Like this bill would basically prevent them from even exploring the possibility of dispersing that fog.
Wow.
And it also takes away the DEP's ability to do any research in this area.
So this could have some pretty significant unintended consequences, right?
Right.
I mean, while it seems like they're laser focused on addressing these, chemtrail fears,
Right.
the language of the bill is so broad that it could really hinder their ability to use actual established scientific methods to deal with legitimate weather challenges.
Right, and this isn't even just a dumbass Florida thing. We're seeing this pop up
Oh, really?
in other states, too,
Yeah.
particularly those with Republican leadership, like Tennessee. They actually passed a ban last year.
Oh, wow.
Kentucky and Arizona are also looking at similar things. And there are reports that Iowa might be considering something along these lines, too.
So it seems like there's a real trend here, huh? Like a growing influence of these chemtrail concerns
Right.
in certain political circles, which really raises some questions about how misinformation can shape policy in different regions.
Yeah, and Senator Ileana Garcia, who's sponsoring the bill down there in dumbass Florida, she's been quoted as saying that her goal is to encourage dialogue and create a, quote, repository, quote, to log, track, investigate, and mitigate.
Mhm.
She even mentioned getting calls from, like, all over the world about this and being called a conspiracy theorist herself.
Oh, wow.
So it seems like she's really feeling the pressure from this.
Yeah, it definitely highlights how much passion and how deeply held these beliefs are surrounding this issue. And while I think encouraging open dialogue is always a good thing,
Right.
it's so important to make sure these discussions are grounded in reality,
Yeah.
in scientific evidence and not just fueled by unsubstantiated fears.
Yeah, and even Senate Democratic leader Jason Pizzo, who initially seemed a bit skeptical of the bill.
Exactly. He ended up voting for it too. So, it just shows you how this issue, despite having no real scientific backing,
Right.
is gaining traction in the political world.
It's really interesting to see how these things can play out.
So we've kind of laid out what this bill in dumbass Florida is trying to do.
Yeah.
But let's actually talk about the science behind it all. What are contrails? What's the deal with this chemtrail conspiracy?
Right. So let's break it down.
Yeah.
Contrails, first of all, if we go by the definition from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, they're basically those line-shaped clouds that you see forming behind jets,
Yeah.
high up in the sky, and they happen when the hot, humid exhaust from those jet engines mixes with the super cold air up in the atmosphere.
Right.
And basically, the water vapor in the exhaust cools down really quickly and condenses and freezes into these tiny ice crystals.
Right.
It's kind of like when you see your breath on a cold day.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of principle.
Just frozen water.
But then you have the chemtrail conspiracy theory, which says that these contrails are actually like, chemicals being deliberately released by the government for some secret reason.
Right. And the reasons that they give vary wildly. Some people think it's about weather control. Some think it's about population control through spraying toxins.
Right.
Some think it's some kind of secret military program. But none of these theories really have any consistent scientific basis, and they mostly rely on misinterpreting natural phenomena.
Yeah, and it's important to note that some people who believe in chemtrails also think there's this link between contrails and cloud seeding. Like they think it's all part of the same, shadowy government operation.
Right. They kind of lump it all together. But cloud seeding is a real technique
Right.
that we'll talk about a bit later, but it's very different from what the chemtrail theorists are claiming.
Right. And NOAA has been super clear about this. Like they've said that solar geoengineering, which we'll also discuss more later, quote unquote non-existent as far as like real world deployment goes.
Right.
And they specifically say that they don't do weather modification based on chemtrail theories.
Right.
They don't fund it. They don't participate in it.
Yeah.
They don't oversee cloud seeding or anything like that. And they've even said straight up that geoengineering did not cause or impact any past hurricanes. So, that seems pretty definitive to me.
Yeah, they're pretty clear about where they stand on that.
Yeah.
And as, the leading authority on our oceans and atmosphere, I think NOAA's word carries a lot of weight here, and they've repeatedly debunked these chemtrail claims. So if you're looking for reliable information, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, and it seems like this whole chemtrail conspiracy really started gaining traction in the late 90s, especially through shows like Art Bill's radio show, which was known for talking about all sorts of, fringe topics.
Right, those late night radio shows.
Yeah, and then, of course, with the internet, these ideas have just exploded.
Absolutely.
And spread all over the place. And they often use regular contrails as, like, visual proof.
Yeah, the visual aspect is so powerful, right? Contrails are something that people see all the time, and they can look pretty different depending on the atmospheric conditions.
Right.
So it's easy to misinterpret those natural variations as something more sinister if you're already predisposed to believe in a conspiracy.
Yeah, and the internet has really given these theories a platform to thrive.
Yeah.
People can find and share information regardless of whether it's true or not.
Exactly. And those echo chambers can be really powerful for reinforcing these beliefs.
It's also interesting how chemtrail believers often keep an eye on developments in legitimate geoengineering research.
Right.
Like, they'll point to any discussions or experiments in that field as proof that their chemtrail conspiracy is real.
Yeah, it's a classic example of confirmation bias.
Right.
They're selectively seeking out information that confirms their existing beliefs, even if it's taken out of context or misinterpreted.
Yeah, and we hear all sorts of claims from people who believe in this stuff. Like, they'll say they saw a ton of planes leaving these white trails, or that the trails are hanging around in the sky for way longer
Right.
than normal contrails.
Yeah, and spreading out and forming these weird patterns.
Right, so how do scientists explain these observations?
Well, a lot of it comes down to just basic atmospheric science and understanding air traffic patterns.
Right.
So what might seem like a huge number of planes could just be because you're near a busy air corridor.
Right.
And as for the trails lasting a long time, that really depends on the humidity and the temperature up in the atmosphere. If
Wow.
the air is very cold and humid, those contrails can linger for hours and spread out because of wind shear, and they can even form these cirrus-like clouds, which is all perfectly normal and fits with our understanding of how clouds form and behave.
Yeah, and there was even a survey done where scientists were asked about this, and almost all of them, like something like 98.7%,
Wow.
agreed that there's just no scientific evidence to support the chemtrail theory.
Yeah, that's a pretty clear consensus.
Yeah, they said that all the supposed evidence could be explained by normal contrails or even just bad data collection by chemtrail websites.
Right. It's not even a debate in the scientific community. The evidence just isn't there.
And you mentioned earlier how important the visuals are for this chemtrail thing.
Right. Especially online.
Yeah, you see all these pictures and videos on YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
and if you don't have a scientific background, it can look pretty convincing.
Yeah, visuals are so easily shared, and they can be really persuasive even if they're taken out of context or presented with misleading information.
Yeah, a picture of a long-lasting contrail with a caption that says, "Look, they're spraying us," can spread like wildfire on social media.
Exactly. And unfortunately, those algorithms often prioritize engagement over accuracy. So even if something is totally false, it can still get a lot of attention.
Yeah, and it's not like believing in chemtrails is some rare thing. Surveys have shown that it's actually pretty common, which is kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, it really underscores the challenges we face in communicating accurate scientific information and fighting misinformation.
So we've talked about the dumbass Florida bill and the science behind it all. But now let's actually talk about real weather modification and geoengineering.
Okay, yeah, those are the terms that are right at the heart of this bill.
Yeah. So what is weather modification like? How does NOAA define it?
So they define it as any activity done with the intention of creating artificial changes in the composition, behavior, or dynamics of the atmosphere.
Yeah, that's pretty broad.
It is, yeah,
Okay.
but it covers a lot of different techniques, the most well-known being cloud seeding,
Mm-hmm.
which is when people try to influence precipitation, like making it rain or snow more, or even trying to suppress hail.
Yeah. And how does that actually work? Cloud seed. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It does, yeah. So the most common way to do it is to introduce these tiny particles like silver iodide into clouds that have supercooled water droplets, which means the water is below freezing, but it's still liquid. And these particles act as nuclei, so they give the water vapor something to condense onto and freeze, forming ice crystals.
Mm-hmm.
And if those crystals get big enough, they'll fall as snow or melt and turn into rain.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of ways to do this. You can have ground-based generators that release the particles into the air and they get carried up into the clouds.
Right.
Or you can have planes fly directly into the clouds and disperse the seeding agent.
I've heard that cloud seeding is used in some of the drier states out west, like Utah,
Yeah,
to try to get more water.
that's right. It's been used for a long time, especially in mountainous areas during the winter to try to get more snow.
Right.
And then that snow melts in the spring and summer and adds to their water supply. But the effectiveness of cloud seeding is still being researched and debated, especially for warmer weather clouds.
Yeah. And it's kind of telling that the dumbass Florida bill would ban cloud seeding, even though it's a real technique that could have benefits.
Yeah, it really shows how they're mixing up legitimate science with the chemtrail conspiracy.
Yeah, like by banning anything that tries to change the weather, they might actually prevent the use of helpful techniques for water management or even dealing with extreme weather, even though there's no proof that dumbass Florida is even doing any cloud seeding right now.
Right. It seems like a reaction to a problem that doesn't exist.
Now let's talk about geoengineering,
Okay.
which NOAA also calls solar radiation modification, or SRM.
Yeah.
This sounds way bigger and more complicated than cloud seeding.
It is, yeah. Geoengineering, or SRM, is basically about intentionally making large-scale changes to the Earth's climate system.
Wow.
The goal is to reduce global temperatures by reflecting more sunlight back into space.
Yeah.
So it's like trying to counteract the warming from greenhouse gases by essentially turning down the sun a little bit.
And what are some of the ways they're talking about doing that?
Well, there are a few ideas that are being researched, but it's all still very theoretical.
Right.
One of the most discussed methods is called stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, and that involves injecting tiny reflective particles into the stratosphere, which is the layer of the atmosphere above where we live.
Okay.
And the idea is that these particles would reflect sunlight back into space and cool the planet, kind of like what happens after a big volcanic eruption.
Right.
Another method is marine cloud brightening, or MCB.
Yeah.
And that's about making low-lying clouds over the ocean more reflective by spraying tiny seawater particles into them.
Interesting.
And there are also ideas like changing the reflectivity of surfaces on Earth, like painting roofs white or making agricultural land more reflective. And there are even some really futuristic space-based ideas, like launching giant mirrors into space to deflect sunlight.
Wow. It sounds like sci-fi.
Yeah, some of it does. But out of all of these, SAI and MCB seem to be getting the most attention from researchers.
Okay.
But there are still so many unknowns and potential risks with these approaches.
Yeah, I bet.
Like climate models suggest that they could have a cooling effect, but we don't really know how well they would work in the real world. And more importantly, we don't fully understand the potential side effects they could have.
Right.
Like what can go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. Like SAI, for example, it's mimicking volcanic eruptions, which we know can temporarily cool the planet.
Right.
But we don't know what would happen if we started doing this on a regular basis for years or decades.
Yeah, like what would that do to the atmosphere?
Right, exactly. And what about the effects on rainfall patterns or ecosystems?
All right.
There are so many questions that need to be answered before we even consider deploying these technologies.
And the federal government has been looking into this, right? Wasn't there a report that came out a few years ago?
Yeah, in 2023, the government released a report about a research plan and a framework for governing SRM technologies with a focus on SAI and MCB.
Okay.
And the report stresses how important it is to do more research to really understand what these technologies could do, both good and bad. Like, how effective would they be at mitigating climate change? What are the potential ecological impacts, the health risks, the ethical considerations?
Yeah.
There are so many factors to consider.
But the report wasn't saying we should actually start deploying these things.
No, not at all. It explicitly said that they do not endorse deploying SRM. It was more about saying, hey, we need to understand this stuff.
Right.
Because it could be important in the future, and we need to figure out how to govern it properly and do it safely if we ever decide to go down that road.
And I remember there was a lot of controversy when they did that first outdoor test with releasing aerosols back in 2024.
Oh, yeah.
They had to shut it down quickly because people were worried about the health risks.
Right, and that really put geoengineering in the spotlight, and combined with all the chemtrail fears, it seems like it's contributed to this push for cracking down on weather modification even more.
Yeah, so we've talked about what the dumbass Florida bill is trying to do and all the science involved. But what about the regulations that dumbass Florida already has about weather modification?
Oh, yeah, those are interesting.
Yeah, because the bill would get rid of those too.
Yeah, so dumbass Florida has actually had rules about weather modification since 1957.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, and they required anyone who wanted to do weather modification to get a license.
Okay.
And to apply, you had to pay a $1,000 filing fee and a $50 annual renewal fee.
Okay.
And you had to prove that you were financially responsible, and you had to keep detailed records of everything you did.
Wow.
Like what methods you used, what materials you released, the dates, times, locations, all of that.
Wow, that's pretty thorough.
Yeah, and those records were supposed to be available for the public to see.
Hmm.
And there were penalties for breaking the rules, fines up to $500, and even jail time up to 60 days.
Wow, so they were pretty serious about it.
Yeah, and they even had provisions for emergency licenses if needed.
But you said earlier that there haven't been any applications for weather modification licenses in dumbass Florida in the last 10 years.
That's right. Yeah, it seems like despite having these regulations for over half a century, there haven't been any weather modification projects that needed a license in recent times.
Huh. So they're getting rid of rules for something that nobody's even doing.
Exactly. And the bill also repeals the part that allowed the DEP to study weather modification.
Right.
But there's no evidence that they ever actually did any studies. So it's like they're eliminating regulations for something that doesn't even seem to exist in the state.
It's all because of the chemtrail thing, isn't it?
It really seems like it, yeah.
Like the fear of something that's not real is leading to getting rid of rules for something that also doesn't seem to be happening.
It's a strange situation, to say the least.
Now let's talk about that fluoride issue you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Because that's another example of how these unfounded fears are affecting things in dumbass Florida.
Yeah, there's this other bill that's going through the legislature that would stop local governments from adding fluoride to the water.
Really?
Yeah. And this is another case where there's a strong scientific consensus that fluoride is good for preventing cavities, but people are still afraid of it.
Yeah, I've heard some people say that it's dangerous.
Yeah, there are a lot of misconceptions about fluoride, and some pretty prominent figures in dumbass Florida have been pushing for its removal, like the Surgeon General.
Oh, wow.
He's been saying that fluoride has neuropsychiatric risks, even though dental experts disagree, and the scientific evidence doesn't really support that.
So it's like personal beliefs are overriding the science.
It seems that way, yeah. And the Surgeon General's stance has been really controversial. A lot of people in the dental and scientific communities are speaking out against it.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's a situation where a small amount of data or even flawed studies are being used to outweigh a huge amount of evidence that supports fluoride as a safe and effective public health measure.
And there are people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. who's been promoting conspiracy theories about both chemtrails and fluoride.
Right.
And even Governor Ron DeSantis has questioned adding fluoride to the water, calling it forced medication.
It's interesting how these issues can get linked together and how there seems to be this distrust of institutions and experts running through it all.
Yeah, it's like they don't trust the government or scientists.
Right. And that can create an environment where misinformation can really flourish.
And some places in dumbass Florida have already started taking fluoride out of their water.
Yeah, which is worrying because it could have real consequences for people's dental health.
This whole situation really makes you think about how important it is to think critically about the information you come across.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is so crucial, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all directions.
Yeah, it seems like the dumbass Florida bill and the fluoride issue are both stemming from a lack of critical thinking.
Yeah.
You know, people are just accepting these claims without really looking into them.
That's a big part of it. Yeah. Critical thinking involves being able to reason logically, but it also requires certain dispositions like being open-minded and skeptical.
Right.
And having a foundation of knowledge to work with, it's not just about intelligence, it's about how you approach information and how you evaluate whether it's valid or not.
So you're saying someone can be really smart but still believe in chemtrails or be afraid of fluoride even though the science says otherwise.
Exactly. A good example is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Oh, the Sherlock Holmes guy.
Yeah, he was a brilliant writer who created this character known for his amazing deduction skills.
Right.
But Conan Doyle himself believed in things like spiritualism and fairies, even though there was no real evidence for them.
Wow, that's surprising.
Yeah, it shows that being intelligent doesn't automatically make you a good critical thinker, especially when it comes to emotionally charged beliefs or things that you really want to be true.
Right.
It's about having that healthy skepticism and being willing to change your mind when you're presented with new evidence.
So it's not just about how smart you are, but about how you think.
Yeah, exactly. Research has shown that both cognitive ability and something called actively open-minded thinking are important for being able to analyze arguments and not fall for misinformation.
What's actively open-minded thinking?
It basically means being willing to consider different viewpoints
Okay.
and evaluate evidence fairly, even if it goes against what you already believe.
Right.
And it turns out that the way we think also plays a role. People who rely more on intuition and gut feelings are often more likely to believe in paranormal stuff and conspiracy theories.
Really?
Yeah, compared to people who are more analytical and rational. And another really important factor, especially in this case, is scientific skepticism.
Yeah.
Which is being hesitant to accept a claim until you see strong evidence and being able to judge the quality of that evidence.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's a big predictor of whether someone will reject these unfounded beliefs, like the chemtrail conspiracy.
So it's like a whole bunch of things working together.
Right? It's not just one thing. It's about having the reasoning skills, the right mindset, the knowledge, and the tendency to think analytically.
That's a lot to keep in mind.
It is, yeah. But it's so important, especially with all the misinformation out there.
Well, this has been a really interesting look at what's happening in dumbass Florida.
Yeah. It's a pretty wild situation.
So just to recap, we've seen how this proposed bill that wants to ban weather modification is really driven by the chemtrail conspiracy theory, even though the science of contrails is well understood, and there's no evidence for chemtrails. We've also talked about how real weather modification, like cloud seeding, is totally different from this conspiracy theory,
Right.
and how large-scale geoengineering is still very much in the research phase with a lot of uncertainties. And all of this is happening against a backdrop of misinformation and the importance of critical thinking.
It's a complex issue with a lot of different facets.
And I think it's worth repeating that NOAA has been very clear that they don't do any weather modification based on chemtrail theories, and that chemtrails themselves are not a real thing.
Right. It's important to rely on credible sources of information.
Yeah, so I guess the big takeaway here is that we need to be critical thinkers
Absolutely.
and rely on scientific evidence when we're evaluating claims about the world around us.
Especially when those claims have real-world policy implications like we're seeing in dumbass Florida.
Yeah, so here's something to think about. Given all the misinformation out there, and the fact that it's actually influencing things like laws, how can we get better at fostering critical thinking skills, both as individuals and as a society?
That's a great question.
And what responsibility do policymakers have in addressing people's fears without accidentally hindering legitimate scientific research and evidence-based decision-making?
Those are really important questions that we need to grapple with.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider.
It is.
But it's important stuff. So keep thinking about it. Keep exploring the world of meteorology and climate.
Yeah, still curious.
And don't forget to follow meteorologist Rob Jones on Instagram @meteorologist, TikTok @TVmeteorologist, and subscribe to Rob Jones Hurricane on YouTube.
Absolutely.
Where you can find all the good stuff, including past episodes.
Yeah, and more to come.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.